Our next speaker, Rick Eggerth, is Vice Chair of the Mount Baker Group of the Sierra Club, our local Sierra Club group here. Today's forum is the brainchild of Rick and the Educational Committee of the Mount Baker Group. Rick is a lifelong environmentalist and a retired attorney with years of toxic waste litigation experience against the oil industry. He enjoys researching and discovering hidden secrets that surround our lives, such as the advertising history behind the petrochemical giant's development of the plastic industry. Please welcome Rick Eggerth.
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
If you were alive when The Graduate came out, and you don't have to admit anything, but it was 1967, the world was much different, and plastics were viewed much differently. They were the future. The future looked very rosy. And the older guy's advice was actually good advice. If you'd invested in plastics then, you'd be very happy you made that investment. But unfortunately, the future came along, and after a few years, okay, help me. Yeah, I just wanted to answer. Oh, here we go. Maybe this down here. There we go. After a few years, we had things like this. Recent young whale died, 88 pounds of plastic in its stomach. And we have Greenpeace and United Kingdom scientists studied 105 turtles from the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Mediterranean Sea, and they all had plastic in them. I could go on with this parade of horribles, but I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to say instead is that scientists do predict that more plastics will be in the ocean than there are fish by weight by 2050. And that there's a ton of plastic on Earth now for every person on Earth. There's 7.7 billion people, so I think you can all do that math. And a new study indicates that we may actually be breathing plastic. That just came out a couple weeks ago. Up on halfway up the Pyrenees Mountains in France, they found substantial amount of plastics, microplastics, and the kinds of things that Dr. Ross was talking about. So which is it? Are plastics the boon that was predicted in The Graduate, or are they a bane? Maybe they're both. But the thing is that plastics themselves are not the problem. I do not come here today to paraphrase Shakespeare, to bury plastics, nor to praise them, but to speak truth about them, not the perception that is shaped in the media. The problems are how plastics are made and used, and the lack of planning for the consequences of that use, and the public perception about that planning. In fact, thank you, Mark, for anticipating that a little bit in your talk. So how do you fix the problem? Well, to answer that, you have to answer this. How did single-use plastics, which are the big part of the problem, become such a problem? And the answer lies in the history of plastics. So the plastics were invented in 1869 by a guy named John Wesley Hyatt. He entered a contest which had a $10,000 award, which was a lot of money in 1869, to replace, find a replacement material for billiard balls. Billiard balls were made out of elephant tusk ivory then, and they recognized that it might be a limited resource. And there was an urge for lots of billiard balls, I guess. So he came up with a substitute that was ironically made from cellulose. Wish we had more of that kind of plastic nowadays, because petroleum came along much later, but that's how far back plastics go. World War II really ramped up their production because they began to be important to the war effort. Things like plexiglass noses for planes and nylon parachutes. There was a lot of variety of plastics use that was developed during the war. And then in the 1950s, their manufacture and diversity just completely boomed. And throwaway living, it was actually a phrase, was promised as freedom from the burden of household chores. You wouldn't have to wash and put away your dishes. You could just throw the container away. And in fact, that became a pretty big deal. And it meant that advertising was really coming into its own also, and the plastics industry totally got this. So there's a picture from a Life magazine, obviously posed, but of a family enjoying the joys of throwaway living. Now, in 1953, the American Can Company and Owens Illinois Glass, followed soon by Coca-Cola and Anheuser-Busch and Philip Morris and Dixie Cup and others, most of whom were container-related companies. They created an organization called Keep America Beautiful, or KAB, or I might call it CAB. It was a nonprofit, and its stated mission was, and still is, still around today, to educate and encourage environmental stewardship by the public. It focuses on littering, recycling, community beautification, and very, very powerful ads. It gave us pop culture staples like Litterbug and Every Litter Bit Hurts. And in 1961, some of you may remember this ad, the Susan Spotless ad about a little girl dressed all in white who kept after her parents to stop littering. Don't litter. Be good. And one of the taglines was, "Keeping America Beautiful is a family affair." So the emphasis was on citizen responsibility. But by 1971, the environmental movement and growing pollution concerns were well beyond littering. Now we're talking about smog, unclean water, lots of things that were growing a bigger and bigger problem. And at that time, the expectations in the public of producer responsibility for the items that they produced was also growing. This was a problem for producers and led to one of the most brilliant ads ever created, which I'm probably not going to be able to have run on this stupid computer, but that was the Crying Indian ad. Let me see if I can get this.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
Yeah, this is one of the most popular ads of all time. It was used so much that TV stations were making requests to the ad council to replace the tape that had worn out because they showed it so much. There were also billboards for it, like this. You might recall seeing a billboard like that. And the tagline there is "Get involved now." In other words, you out there, do something. This can be handled. Intensely successful ads. Won a bunch of awards, is just still today, you look at it, I wish you could look at it, and you just go, that's a brilliant ad. Problem was, well, not the problem was, but that it had very subtle, indelible and subtle themes and imagery. The Indian would come paddling out of the idyllic past into the frenzied present where there were cars and litter being thrown everywhere. It played on the national guilt over the treatment of Native Americans. And now it focused not on the joys of throwaway society, but the sins of throwaway society. And especially it focused on the themes of American individualism, self-reliance, and self-determination that would save the day, because we're Americans, damn it, we always find a way. Problem was, it was all manipulation. In fact, the Indian was an Italian-American named Espero di Corti. He played Indians in real life, play action and plays and on screen. It played heavily on the popular zeitgeist then that sympathized with Indians, which had never been higher than it was in 1971. Just the year before, Little Big Man, another Dustin Hoffman movie. Who remembers Little Big Man? Yeah. So that was the first mainstream movie that showed the conquering of the American West from the Native American perspective, and it wasn't a very happy thing to see. At the very moment that the Crying Indian ad in 1971 came along, Alcatraz Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, which you may recall was a prison at one time where Al Capone was incarcerated. It was no longer a prison then, but it was occupied by a band of Indians. Anyone remember that? Yeah. And they were there for weeks or months, and one of the things they wanted to have done was for Alcatraz to be given back to the Native Americans. So putting the Crying Indian ad together was just brilliant for the time. So what brought the ad on? Why was that made by KAB and the Ad Council? Well, by 1971, the plastics and other industries feared they did not embrace environmental values. Despite appearances, KAB had never embraced environmentalism. Its birth in 1953 was in response to a beverage container law in Vermont, what that outlawed non-refillable containers. Think about that for a minute. If you lived in that state today and that law is still in effect, you couldn't use plastic bottles unless they were of a type that could be refilled. So at that time in 1953, single-use packaging was just becoming a big deal, and it was much more profitable for the industry than having the responsibility to take reusable bottles back, clean them, refill them, and send them back out into the public again. So KAB took aim at that legislation, and it lasted only 4 years and then lapsed and was never renewed. But by April 22nd, 1970, who recalls that date? Why is that important? Exactly, the very first Earth Day. By that day, industry was again concerned because environmental protests that had been leading up to and were in part responsible for creating Earth Day focused on throwaway containers and producers' responsibility for their proliferation and their environmental impact. Also scary to industry was that bottle bills were beginning to crop up around the country, which would have required drinks be put in reusable containers, and you pay a small deposit upon purchase, then you get that deposit refunded when you bring the bottle back. I'm sure everyone has had some experience with something like that. Oregon was the very first state to pass that law in 1971. And in the 10 states now with such laws, there's a 60% recovery rate versus only 24% in other states. So it works well. But you may ask, why only 10 states? Well, the industry and Keep America Beautiful fought those bottle bills for years. From 1989 to 1994, for instance, the beverage industry spent $14 million to defeat a proposed national bottle bill. And that was just a drop in the bucket from the amount of money that was spent in opposition to that. But individualism was still being promoted, just like the individualism in the Crying Indian ad and in Susan Spotless ads, that what you, the public, can do. In this case, it was being promoted by calling the the bottle bills, communist. They were communist because they took your right of choice away from you. You could choose to have a single-use crappy plastic bag or plastic bottle, or bag too, but bottles at the time, or you could choose to have a reusable bottle. But taking that choice away from you was going the way of communism. In fact, though, having all these throwaways caused increases in the very litter that Keep America Beautiful had done ads opposing, in natural resource mining, in all sorts of pollution, and in the proliferation of solid waste, meaning landfills, because all the stuff had to go somewhere once it was used. And until the bottle bills opposition, until the opposition of KAB to bottle bills was revealed, they had been viewed by the environmental movement as a friend in arms. In fact, they were supported by groups like the Audubon Society and, yes, Sierra Club. Once it became clear they were opposing bottle bills, though, all that kind of fell by the wayside. And that deceit was also partly enabled by the fact that the industry leaders of all those companies I mentioned and many more that were behind Keep America Beautiful, they kept their involvement quiet and let the fact that Keep America Beautiful was a nonprofit appear to make it seem disinterested. In fact, it was anything but. So, what was the real goal of KAB and the industry leaders behind it? I've been hitting at it. It was to put environmental responsibility for products on the public, while simultaneously cultivating the trust within the environmental movement that KAB was working with them, because they wanted to stop litter, for instance. They must be good. And to let individuals believe that their everyday decisions can fix pollution. That pollution has nothing to do with power, with politics, or with producer responsibility. You can fix litter. Every litter bit hurts. And Heather Rogers, who wrote Green Gone Wrong, How Our Economy is Undermining the Environmental Revolution, kind of a mouthful, but she mentioned that this was the first corporate greenwashing front. You heard greenwashing mentioned earlier today. Basically, it's not a whitewash, it's a greenwash because it's the green environmental movement, but it was still a front. It wasn't real. And has this strategy worked? Yup. It has worked big time. Look, for instance, at Earth Day. Now, Earth Day is great. I'm not taking it on. I'm not opposing it. But press coverage for Earth Day usually offers systemic problems as the responsibility of individuals. If you go on the 2019 earthday.org website, it barely hints at producer responsibility, but emphasizes individual action. And of course, individual action is great. But by emphasizing that, we lose track of the responsibility of the producers for the plastics they produce. The plastic bag regulation, for instance, which unfortunately a statewide bill was defeated here in Washington just a week, 10 days ago. Bottle bills and avoiding the focus on the increasing production of plastic that Alex talked about, these are all things that the industry has been very good at hiding from people's view. And they avoid litigation, which as a former litigator kind of stuns me because there's other unsafe products that work exactly as designed, but yet are unsafe. Like cigarettes and alcohol, for instance. We know there's lots of regulation, and especially with cigarettes, lawsuits that have arisen out of their use. But with plastics, not so much. There's this thing in tort law called product defect claims, meaning you can sue the producer of a product that hurts you for reimbursement. I've yet to hear of a claim like that made against the plastics industry. I don't know if any of you have, but if you have, let me know. I'd be interested in knowing about it. And isn't something that pollutes and kills not inherently defective? I mean, plastics work exactly as designed. They're perfect. But the consequences are a problem. And that has been taken on legally with other things that have the same kind of design, like cigarettes and alcohol. Not yet plastics. So sad to say that recycling and green consumerism may be therapeutic for the masses, but they don't address the lack of producer responsibility. They don't get at the root. They're not, what did Gwen say, radical. And campaigns touting individual responsibility continues today. There's a recent KAB campaign that assured the viewer that bottles and other containers could be reincarnated into beautiful things like plastic benches if only you recycled those. The American Progressive Bag Allowance successfully fights bag bills across the country. It was founded by the American Chemistry Council, which is a multi-industry trade group, and proactively promotes product lines and this kills me, and defends against bag bans and taxes, because bag bans are communist and who likes taxes? It favors state preemption bills, meaning bills in states that preempt any possibility of bag regulation. There are a few states that have passed bills like that. And of course, it promotes the individual's right to choose. And there's massive coordination within that organization and others to fight bag bills and fees that go along with some bag regulation. So the KAB website stresses individual effort and littering, improve recycling, beautify communities, which are good goals, absolutely. They're important, we should try to do those. But they have been turned against us in order to hide the industry responsibility. Why? Because producer responsibility hurts the bottom line and inhibits growth. It's a lot cheaper to make plastic containers than to have to refill and reuse non-plastic. And the plastics industry is all about profit and growth. The plastics growth, global production of plastic resins and fibers grew from 2 million metric tons in 1950 to more than 400 million metric tons in 2015. 65 years, 200 times growth. About half of that came in the 13 years from 2002 to 2015. And there are few man-made materials that have ever grown faster. A couple of exceptions are steel and cement, but steel and cement are notable by their distinction from plastics because they're used in construction. They last for years, they're meant to be durable, they're meant to be around. The largest plastic market is packaging, which you use once and then discard. Half of all plastics are waste within 4 years of use. And there's huge growth coming. In 2015, an American Chemistry Council report talked about this, and they're a who's who. They're a group, a lobby group in Washington D.C. that's basically a who's who of plastics, chemical, and petrochemical companies. And in that report, they said that natural gas fracked from shale makes U.S. plastic resins way cheaper than oil-based feedstocks. And that from 2010 to 2020, they predicted over $130 billion worth of investment in manufacturing capacity and 462,000 new jobs. And that net plastic resin exports, remember Alex talked about exporting of xylene from right here in our area, that will triple between 2014 and 2030. So there's going to be a lot of growth coming. But the ACC report mentions nothing about environmental impact. I can say that honestly because I read the entire report, it's not that long, mentions nothing. You might say, well, its focus is economic and jobs-oriented. Why should it mention environment? Well, I would respond that environmental impact and regulatory compliance do affect the economy. Communities are hurt by natural gas fracking. Billions of tons of CO2 come from the extraction process. About 15% of the global carbon budget by 2050 is going to be just from the process of extracting fossil fuels from the ground. 15%. And the health impacts, of course, of micro and nanoplastics in the water and the atmosphere are nasty. So environmental science has come up with what Gwen talked about, the circular plastics economy, which is a closed loop, basically. You manufacture, you use, you recycle, you reuse, nothing leaks out. But that requires improved economics and technologies and replacing single-use plastics with safer options and eventually eliminating fossil fuel plastics. So that's bad news for the petrochemical companies who rely ever more on plastics profit, again, as I think Alex pointed out. And a Shell executive recently acknowledged that investing in chemicals is part of our strategy to thrive through the energy transition. Okay. But according to the Center for International Environmental Law, this boom will perpetuate a fossil fuel economy that underpins both the climate crisis and the plastics crisis while impacting frontline communities and the wider public at every stage of its toxic life cycle. Yikes. So it certainly seems reasonable then, doesn't it, that the ACC report should have mentioned the environmental concerns? Who thinks it would have been reasonable to mention that? Yeah, I know you all agree. The thing is, the fact that there was zero mention of environmental impact speaks volumes about the industry and its confidence in its control of the message that it is not responsible. Because if they felt not confident in that, they would have mentioned things. They would have tried to anticipate environmental problems. And by the way, that report, it wasn't leaked or anything. It's on the internet. So if we are to have any chance to avoid a plastic planet, it's got to change. Okay? You're going to say, how? Rick, smart guy, how's it going to change? Well, recycling doesn't really work, even without the issues of China not taking it anymore. If you look at the total amount of plastics waste accumulation by 2015, we are at 6.3 billion tons. 9% of that had been recycled. 12% had been incinerated, which is a poor solution because it releases carbon into the air. And 79% was in landfills or the environment, meaning a lot of it in the ocean. So most ocean plastics come from countries with poor recycling programs and infrastructure, so that even US recycling efforts, no matter how good we might be, are going to have little effect on that. So what do you think? What do you do? Well, with apologies to Apple, we have to think different. We have to turn KAB's slogan of reduce, reuse, and recycle inside out. And I say we go with refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle. In other words, we should refuse plastic products as much as humanly possible. Thank you, Gwen, for the segue into my talk. And start educating ourselves right now on alternatives while also reducing, reusing, and recycling. But in addition, the plastics industry needs to refuse to avoid responsibility for global consequences. They need to reduce plastics when other materials are available, and they need to refuse or reuse and recycle all plastics at an industrial level. Sounds great, right? Okay. But it's a tall order, isn't it? It's kind of a paradigm shift. But the US plastics industry actually agrees with most of that. In February of this year, there was the ACC Plastics Division, the American Chemistry Council Plastics Division, announced 2 ambitious circular economy goals. That by 2040, 100% of plastics packaging would be reused, recycled, and recovered, and that by 2030, 100% would be either recyclable or recoverable. Those are great goals, absolutely. But the ACC, and the ACC says they're achievable, but they also are going on this massive expansion binge right now. So you can't really have both, not without a significant shift in technology, which isn't there yet, that would allow the plastics expansion they're planning to be of a type that is a closed plastics economic plastics circle. So it feels like it's more greenwashing. But the goals do acknowledge the problems, so can we hold industry to their words? Sure, let producers know that we know about those goals. We know what you're saying, so live up to it. Seek to speed the goals up. 2040 and 2030 are great. How about 2025 and 2030? Let's point out the contradiction between those goals and the expansion that they plan, and let's call for greater producer responsibility. Okay, how do we do that? I don't know, to be honest. But I do think that we need to refuse plastics and let the producers know you're doing it and educate everyone that you can. Patricia talked about this. If you let the producers know you're not happy with their products, you're not going to use it, they will change. Hit them in the pocketbook. And then write, email, phone, and talk to your all legislators, the plastics manufacturers to stop expansion, plastics bottlers and baggers to avoid plastics and use safer substitutes. Oppose facilities and operations that are planned for expansion by plastics producers, and write, email, phone, and talk to local grocers and businesses on how they can reduce plastics. When they're local, they know you, they want to help, they want to be engaged with you, but we have to talk to them. And that can come either orally or social media or however else you want to do it, but get out there and talk. We have contact information for local legislators, their addresses on 2 sheets for every representative and senator in the state. You can make a copy of that. I'll have it over at my table. So that's it.